Hello, everybody. I'm very honored to have Mark Gober here today. And we're going to talk about some very interesting things. The major subject is evil. And so we're going to jump right into my first question. Mark, you are well known as an outside the box thinker. What are your thoughts on the notion that evil forces may be controlling and even establish the structure of our society?
Hmm. I'm very open to that. In terms of having established our society, I would have a lot of question marks because one would have to understand our true origins and the true history of humanity, which I have a lot of questions about. But in terms of evil's influence in the history that we know for sure that we've lived, at least, I do think that that's a real phenomenon. And when we're talking about evil here, I guess we're talking about some kind of an energy that seems to oppose the natural state of consciousness, which seems to be one of unconditional love and interconnectedness, something inherently benevolent. And how I arrived there, I mean, it takes multiple books to even talk about it, but that's basically what my overarching hypothesis is that there is something benevolent that serves as the substrate of reality. And what we might call evil is the obstruction of that. So there's an analogy from Dr. David Hawkins, a spiritual teacher. He talked about how the sun is always shining its rays. And we could say analogously, that's the fundamentally benevolent consciousness that we're all a part of. And there can be clouds that get in the way of those rays. And they can happen with us internally as we have maybe negative emotions or traumas. But on a collective scale, we might call the let's say the complete obstruction of those rays as the purest form of evil. And that maybe that's what's going on in the world today is that there are these clouds that exist in energetic form that interact with our world and sometimes directly influence people through the person's own choice, where the person says, well, I want to oppose a loving force, and therefore I'm going to try to invoke this dark, evil force for my own power or for my own benefit out of selfishness. And maybe it also happens in a more indirect way where these forces get in through our own negative emotions and traumas, and we don't even realize it, that they're influencing us and influencing our behavior.
Well, there's a whole lot to unpack there, so I'm going to do my best. The first thing I want to go into that you mentioned was it sounds like from your answer that when I'm talking about the structure of society, that we don't even really understand the origins of our society. Would that be accurate?
That's how I feel. I mean, we can see this even in current news cycles where there are completely different depictions of the same event.
Uh,
And then people will choose to believe one thing, and then maybe that one depiction becomes the predominant narrative that goes into history books. And just so if we apply that uncertainty in the age of technology, where we have people who can basically be citizen journalists and actually show what happened in different things, imagine what happened in longer ago, where we don't really know what if what we're told is true, or who was actually writing the history, or what was a manipulation versus what's not. I think there are a lot of questions about what the real history of humanity is.
yeah, that's a fascinating subject. In fact, I think that would be deserving of a podcast too. But we'll keep going forward. The second thing, and I don't disagree with you by the way on that.
Yeah.
The second thing that I want to bring up is what you said before. It seems to me that there's a duality at play that you need evil. If you have good, you need evil. First of all, is that accurate of my understanding?
Um, it's something I'm grappling with myself. So I think your earlier question was more of like establishing the existence of evil, and now you're moving into why would it be there, which is
Yeah.
a very intriguing question. I would say the most common hypothesis that I've come across from people who have had direct experiences of other dimensions, let's say, and also people who have studied various spiritual traditions and religious traditions all over the world, is that there is a force that can cause suffering and pain, but that force ultimately is evolutionary because it stimulates growth. It forces us either to overcome something within ourselves, overcome deceptions, meaning to harness our discernment, to test our morals and our virtues. So having the contrast of perhaps something that's made of unconditional love at the basis of reality with this lack of that, it creates contrast that allows for growth and experience. Because if everything were just made of unconditional love, then would there be any experience really beyond that? Would you even be able to tell that there's something? So it's like, can you tell that anything exists without something that opposes it?
Right.
Maybe at a fundamental level. Otherwise, You would see just a unity without any distinction.
I've heard said before that when we consider things like good and evil, from our limited human perspective, we can't see that the evil is actually a good if you were to step out of this current perspective. Sometimes that kind of thinking lends itself to saying there is no objective good and evil. In your in your view, is there an objective good and evil?
Hmm. Now we're getting into some deep waters about basically like the nature of truth or objective truth or levels of truth, because I do think at one level of reality, I'd agree with you that there probably is no evil, that there's just the oneness and everything within the oneness is part of that. But on another level, there are certain things that I don't think we can shy away from, and we would have to label them as evil. So we could take maybe horrific things done to children, like pedophilia. I mean, take the worst case examples. It
Right.
would be irresponsible to just ignore that and say, "Oh, well, maybe the child's soul just needed that," or something like some kind of rationale to rationalize horrible behavior. Even though at some level of reality, maybe there was some net benefit to the world that we can't see.
Right.
Like I often think about it as if we're walking through a maze right now. We can't see what's very far ahead of us in the maze. But if there were a helicopter looking down at the full maze, we'd be able to understand where we are and what's ahead. So there could be things that seem like they are, well, that actually do cause a lot of pain and suffering. And we see the pain and suffering and we label that as evil. And in many ways, it is at that localized level. But if you really zoom out, you can see that there's some benefit to it. And there's a story that Dr. David Hawkins told that really has stuck with me on this point because part of me, especially when I started this spiritual journey, I wanted to say, well, yeah, we can just rationalize all suffering. It's fine. Everyone's learning through it. And yet there was a part of me that didn't understand that because it could lead to a passivity where you say, okay, well, I'm not going to do anything about the evil in the world, which is something evil would love, is if no one did anything to stop it. And so by the way, Dr. Hawkins was a top psychiatrist in New York, and he had several spiritual awakenings that led him to leave society, meditate for years, and he eventually decided to return to society and wrote many famous books like Letting Go, Power versus Force, The Eye of the Eye. And the story that he told was a saying by Ramana Maharshi, a famous Indian sage, who said that the world that we see doesn't exist. And the implication there is, look, the suffering we see that doesn't really exist because it's all a Maya, it's all some kind of an illusion,
Right.
which at some level of reality might be true. But what David Hawkins said is, look, most people are not operating at the level that Ramana Maharshi is. They're not operating at that level of truth. They're operating from a level where they're feeling everything. And to them, the world is very real. So
Yes.
what Hawkins said is that it would be a spiritual error to ignore the pain and suffering because nothing really exists. And so I think this applies to the notion of evil, the paradox there that maybe there is no evil, but to ignore it is also irresponsible.
I couldn't agree more. And it reminds me of I had read a book by Eckhart Tolle that we talked about something similar where it gave this abstract answer about how suffering doesn't exist and we don't exist. But the truth is, if you see someone suffering, and obviously if you're suffering, it very much is your reality. You cannot escape it. And also what you mentioned, and I think you talked about it in the book that I read that you wrote. I'm blanking on the title of this book, but it's where everything is a two dimensions and it's the flat. Do you know what I'm talking about? The 1970
Flatland.
flatland, right? The analogy of the maze and the helicopter, right? From all those shapes. In fact, if you want to, since you mentioned in your book, Flatland, what was that book about and the allegory? Because I think it applies to the helicopter maze that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's a very good point. The idea of flatland is that you have a civilization of people who are living basically on a piece of paper. It's a two-dimensional world that is totally flat in that sense.
Right.
But if you imagine a three-dimensional object intersecting with flatland, like a sphere, the first point of intersection would just be a single point where the sphere intersects with the flat piece of paper. And the people in flatland can't perceive three-dimensional sphere. All they see is the intersection point, and they say, wow, there's a point there. And they can study the point and they can say, look, we fully understand this point, but they're missing the full sphere. And the sphere goes down even further. And then you end up with the intersection as a circle.
Hmm.
It's basically a cross section of the sphere. Same problem. The people in flatland who can only perceive it at that two-dimensional level of reality, they're analyzing the circle, they understand it perfectly, but they've missed the entire sphere. So it's
Right.
the same. I agree with you that we might call things evil from our lens, from 2D land, quote unquote, and we miss the three-dimensional reality.
Well, I think that's so true in life. I mean, we may think that we understand things, but we have a limited perspective, as that book mentions, right? We can't even contemplate and imagine, like the characters in that story can imagine a three-dimensional reality. It's just beyond their capability, their perspective. And I think whether or not we're talking about evil or anything else that's going on in the world, we often are proceeding from these very limited viewpoints. And so we are even incapable of entertaining ideas that are outside of that. I wanted to go back to something you said a few minutes ago. Um, you were talking, if I understood correctly, about how evil acts on the individual, where evil comes from. And this is my interpretation because I wanted to ask you where you thought evil came from. But let's just go with this for a moment here. In popular movies like Animal House, there's that scene where he's got an angel on one side and a devil on another, and right, that's a very facile way to look at something like this. But when it comes to evil acting on individuals and acting on, let's say, groups of individuals, where do you think that evil comes from? Is it from the thoughts in our minds? Do you think that there other entities might be even acting upon us? Um, where some people think it's the devil. Where do you think this evil originates?
Hmm. Well, the answer is ultimately a deeply metaphysical one. And if we go with the hypothesis that I've explored in my books, that the nature of reality is a unified field of consciousness, basically, some might call that God, we can call it whatever we want to call it, but it's a unified field of benevolent intelligence that's made of unconditional love. And everything that we experience, including the contrast of our reality, are just modulations of that unified field of consciousness, which would mean that anything we call evil is within it. That's one metaphysics. There might be others that people have surmised, and I don't know how we would test them, but that there could be this unified field of consciousness that exists, and then somehow outside of that, there's a dark force too that can interrupt. But let's go with the other one, this idea that there's just a oneness that we're a part of, and the evil is embedded within it. Then I think that it's like I was saying before, it's part of creating contrast for us to make choices. And I do think the idea of an angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other is a nice depiction where we seem to have the choice, all of us, with our actions and even our thoughts of what we want to do. Like we have physical bodies and we could do harm to other beings if we wanted to, based on just physics. We could do that, but we have a choice not to.
Mhm.
So that there's something about maybe being tested, like being in a video game almost, that we are obstructed from the nature of reality that we at some level know about, and it's our choice not to have the answers to the test, so to speak, and to see how we do. And these dark forces, demonic or otherwise, are there to act as the bad guys in the game that we have to transcend.
Yeah, I mean, that led to me to the question I want to ask you next was the ontological purpose of evil, and you're touching upon it very much. So, this idea, if you think about the Ten Commandments and you think about the rules of society that we live under, um, we are often faced with these temptations, and they seem to us very alluring, much like a candy bar is alluring to you at midnight if you're hungry and you want a snack. And so, I don't know if you ever saw the TV show Westworld. Did you ever see Westworld?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So I think it's a perfect encapsulation for those that don't know. It's a story in which a theme park is created where these cyborgs using artificial intelligence are created and they look almost indistinguishable from human beings. And so people will go there, they'll pay huge sums of money to interact with these cyborgs. And so they can do a number of things. They could be in what they call the white hat scenario where they're an adventurer and they're trying to save the damsel in distress. But many people choose the black hat version where they can do any number of horrible things from raping and killing the various AI and cyborgs. And so, going back to what you mentioned a moment ago, it seems to me that it might be a spiritual test in a way, right? You're given these choices in life, and how you choose to, what choice you make progresses you in almost a video game fashion because we use all of these heuristics to understand it. But would that be an accurate way of describing the purpose of evil?
I think it might be from our 2D land lens. And the real answer might be way beyond what we can understand. And it's so layered. That's where I'm landing. So I generally take the hypothesis along the lines of what you just said, but I think there's probably more to it than we could even contemplate right now.
When you look around at the world today and we see the immense amount of suffering, we see multiple world wars, we see the COVID pandemic and all the destruction it wrought. Do you think there are times in which there is more evil in the world than others? And are we living in that time?
Hmm. I'm really not sure. Uh, with modern technology, there are more things that we can be exposed to than perhaps we've been able to see in the past. So maybe it seems like there's more right now, or maybe it's existed and it's just coming to the surface now more than it has historically, whereas evil used to be just more hidden and now it's like being exposed. So I'm not sure if there's more now than there has been historically, but maybe there's more awareness of it now on a grand scale than there has been in the past. And also everything with regard to COVID, we saw for the first time that I'm aware of in human history where governments around the world acted in unison to restrict people's behavior
Mm.
based on their opinions of science. So that there's something about technology that it's enabling new things that we haven't had in the past.
Well, what's interesting when you say that is the way in which the governments proceeded was always with this idea that they were doing good in the world. They were being benevolent. And it reminds me of the ways in which the United States always ends up in wars. It's always we're liberating another country. We were attacked first, and so we need to respond in kind. It seems to me some of the most evil atrocities in the world began this way, where people, would claim that they're doing good in the world, but it leads to so much more suffering.
Yeah, actually, this is a theme in my fifth book. It's called An End to the Upside Down Reset. And part of the subtitle is about caring people who are fooled into supporting harmful causes.
Mhm.
And often great evil is perpetrated under the guise of benevolence. So, as the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions,
Yeah.
where sometimes it's done innocently, where someone, let's just say, they recommend a medication to a family member because they think it's going to help that person, but they haven't done the research and the medication is actually very harmful just because they haven't researched it. But according to their belief system, it would help, and they might end up doing harm to that person. Versus others who will masquerade under the guise of compassion, where they say, we're doing this to protect you, full well knowing that it will be authoritarian in the end. And they're saying, we need to restrict your behavior because it's for the greater good, even though it might harm many people in the process. And they know that. So I do think there's a spectrum of people who do it innocently and others who do it to fool. But it seems like if let's just put ourselves from the perspective of evil, if we wanted to enact really horrible things, it's much easier to probably get mass approval by saying we're doing this to help you versus saying, hey, we want to enslave you and harm you and cause a lot of suffering. That's
Yeah.
not going to go over very well. So there is this notion that of evil genius, that it could be an intelligent force that knows how to manipulate people.
I really want to go back to the intelligent force idea in just one moment, but I also want to bring up something that I've noticed a lot because we were talking about popular culture. So I don't know if you have Netflix or not. I have Netflix, I have Prime, and I have Hulu. And the titles on all of these platforms are so hellish and nightmarish. And these are the things that we're seeing from time to time. It's so bad that we have two young kids, and so I don't even let them just surf around on the adult version of Prime. Obviously, there's a kids version of Netflix as well. But just looking at the pictures that come up on these shows, when I think about, I mean, I think we're about the same age or so. I mean, when I was growing up, it just felt like the popular depictions in culture were not so evil. It seemed as if there were, and also I have one more thing is the depictions of good guys was not as nuanced. So let's take the show like the Sopranos or Breaking Bad as a perfect example, right? You have a very conflicted anti-hero. Some would say, I mean, he's if that show were just flipped slightly, he'd be a perfect villain, right, for what he
Mm-hmm.
does, right? Now, if you look at something like, let's say, Star Wars, the first episode four, right, it's very clear cut that Luke is the good guy. I mean, even Han Solo, who is the anti-hero, there's no sense of moral ambiguity like there is with, let's say, Tony Soprano. Seems to me, though, that in recent years, popular culture has certainly gone dark. And it's not just movies and TV, it's music as well. I mean, the things that people are singing about in the 1950s couldn't be more different from what they're singing about in the 2020s. What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, there is some blatantly satanic imagery that we see in pop culture increasingly, and it's often positioned as just artistic or otherwise, but anyone can see this in performances or just lots of art. So it's not portrayed as something serious among those who will defend it. They'll say, well, this is, they often have a non-spiritual metaphysics of life. So they say this isn't an actual force or anything. We're just showing
Right.
you something. And I do think there's an increase in that. And I wonder also how this relates to mind control and being able to manipulate the human psyche. Because the human psyche is probably fragile in ways that we don't fully understand. And there's a whole MK Ultra project within the US government that has been declassified that talks about methods of manipulating the human mind, even dissociating the human mind. So using trauma, inducing trauma on a person to split the personality and to
Right.
create multiple personalities that have different um, skills sometimes, and the personalities don't even know about each other. So I do wonder about when we talk about pop culture, what is being intentionally manipulated by those who understand the psyche. And along those lines, I want to raise an area that I'm still learning about myself, but it intrigues me. It's called German New Medicine. And it was conceived by a doctor in Germany, Dr. Hammer, who basically discovered that when you examine brain scans, there are lesions in the brain that correspond to emotional traumas, which then correspond to organs. So after looking at lots of brain scans, there are patterns that emerge. And if a person comes to the doctor and says, I have this kind of cancer or this kind of medical issue I'm dealing with, they can tell you the conflict shock that you dealt with. And if let's say let's say it's an accurate science. If it is, then one who understood that would know how to induce physical ailments by creating conflict shocks, whether it's through the media or otherwise, to create, let's say, movies that cause traumas that a person might not associate as a trauma. It might be a minor thing, a seemingly minor thing, but it creates this trauma that then results in some kind of physical ailment. I'm again thinking from the perspective of evil genius. If someone understood the human psyche very well and the human biology, what would you want to do to those to the general public? If you were evil, you might want to induce all sorts of traumas, sometimes explicitly, other times more subtly.
Yeah, I mean, going back to what you mentioned earlier about the fragility of the human psyche, I think it's very apparent. If you look at, speaking of pop culture, I mean, think about Good Will Hunting for just a moment. Here we have someone who was deeply physically abused, Matt Damon's character in that movie. And so that whole movie is dealing with the trauma of it. In fact, my wife, her dad also experienced a lot of physical trauma, very similar to what Good Will Hunting does experienced as a child. And when he came out of that movie, she told me he was just weeping because he had had similar experiences. And I can't help but think as we look at the programs that are being offered, and interesting that they use that word program, by the way, for TV shows, right? Like I just thought of this too. I mean, think about it. There's a show called Lucifer. Literally, there's a show called Lucifer right now. Um, and so when you're talking about fracturing the human psyche and talking about MK Ultra, it seems to me that um, evil genius would be able to understand us very well, and they would understand the layers of trauma that you can inflict in a society. People may look okay on the surface, but that is not taking into account the many traumas that they've experienced. I mean, just in our limited lifetimes, we've had things like 9/11, COVID, multiple wars, and on, and not to mention hurricanes, floods, crime, very violent crime as well. And I think it's worth considering what this does to the human psyche, with this other caveat, which is this, going back to our what we talked about earlier, maybe there is an ontological purpose for this. It's almost like no pain, no gain. If you didn't go through such tremendous trauma and psyche, you wouldn't have that kind of personal spiritual growth. So that's kind of where I go with this too.
I lean that way too. And also, if you were already at a more elevated state, you might have been able to circumvent the evil or not fall for the deception.
Mm.
But because you did, then there was suffering inflicted upon you, which then forced you to look at something. Because of the suffering, you had no choice but to try to consider the truth or to consider something new. And the analogy I often give is just my own experience. I was a competitive tennis player growing up. I played in Division I tennis in college, and training was really hard, like physically and mentally painful. But if I did do that, I was not as good a tennis player, especially compared to other players who were training really hard too. So I could see directly the relationship sometimes between the suffering and my own success and my own development and growth and evolution. And it was through that suffering and all the training that I learned the nuances and I learned how to not make tactical mistakes, let's say, within when it came down to it in the tennis matches that were really serious. So I wonder if there's some parallel to be drawn with evil
Yeah,
more broadly.
right. I mean, so Nietzsche says, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, right? And so I think that it very much goes along with what you're saying there. If you think about the most entitled, spoiled people you'll ever meet, they're typically people that haven't experienced a lot of setbacks and struggles and suffering, right? They had everything given to them, and so they don't have especially empathy when it comes to other people. On the other hand, I think that what's missing from Nietzsche's quote is this idea that there is a line, though. If you go too far with it, like so, I think of Les Mis. I'm blanking on the name of the character, but essentially, she falls in love with the man. She has the child, and then basically, it goes too far with her suffering and pain, and she just can't go on, and then she gives her child away, right? So it succumbed to the dark forces, right? And I think that you mentioned earlier, people who psyche split, right? If they go through so much profound trauma and pain that there's just no coming back. It seems to me that there is a line. Yes, it makes you stronger, but at a certain point, there is no coming back either.
Hmm. I wonder about that because I have heard stories of people who have been through unimaginable suffering. And I'm thinking of one example in particular. Her name is Serena Faith Masterson, and she wrote a book about this called I Am Serena, where she, from the days of being an infant, was subjected to unimaginable mind control and torture
Yeah,
and developed over 300 distinct personalities because she had endured so much trauma.
yeah,
And through very miraculous circumstances, she came across a healer who Serena then lived with for years, and she has been able to reintegrate her personalities and believes that part of her soul's purpose was actually to endure this stuff and to be able to heal and to serve as a model for others.
yeah.
So when I hear stories like that from someone who's been through it, that's very powerful.
Yes.
Um, so it makes me wonder because when her story has transformed me, and I've talked about it with many other people, and who knows how many people have come across it outside of me and reading her book. Like that's had a powerful impact on people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, similar situation, right? He went through just tremendous, horrible things, and yet his book has been so empowering for so many people. I want to go back to something you mentioned a moment ago when we were talking about other entities. Um, and so, what are your thoughts about this idea that there may be other, whether we call them devils, demons, jinn, other spiritual entities that may be working in this reality, especially producing evil.
Yeah, I do think that's a reality. That's just my current leading hypothesis. I wrote a book called An End to Upside Down Contact, where I basically survey examples of contact with what appear to be non-human intelligences, both in the modern era and throughout history. And there's a common theme everywhere that there are dark entities that people have communicated with. And in some cases, people have even engaged in rituals where they invoke a lot of suffering in
Hmm.
order to bring about these beings. And people who have been part of these rituals say that the beings have shown up sometimes. So I think there's a confluence of evidence here, historically and in modern times, suggesting that this is not just fiction. And given everything we see happening in the world and how much pain and suffering that exists, to me, it just makes sense that there could be agents of this dark force. However, I do want to caveat here. I mentioned this in my book on medicine, actually, when I talk about exorcisms. There's a very prominent doctor, his last name is Gallagher, who's written about this, like Princeton and maybe Yale trained or something, and now he's performing exorcisms. He says they're very rare, but basically there are demonic beings that take over a person's psyche. Um, but in that context, I was looking at what a Catholic priest said about it, and his view was after actually having communicated with these demons performing exorcisms that there was a being that told him this. So it was a demonic being that said this to him that they're sent by God
Mm.
because they become such agents of change in the person if they're able to overcome the demonic possession that they become basically sanctified.
Have you read, I think it's called Conversations with God. Have you read that book?
Neil Donald Walsh, I haven't read the book, but I'm familiar with his work.
Okay, so it reminds me of a scene in that book where I believe it's two brothers and one is good and one is evil, and the other brother gets to heaven and he asks why the other one was so evil. And I'm paraphrasing because it's been a while since I read it. And the evil brother explains that it was for what you just mentioned there, for his growth. So I want to go back to what and make sure I understood this correctly. So you're saying that this a Catholic priest who had done a lot of exorcisms had an opportunity to talk to one of these demons, and
Yes.
the demon said that God installed him in this way to do it for. for spiritual growth from the person that was suffering from the possession. Is that accurate?
Yes, it is. I actually want to find the quote for you, Michael. I think it's worth pulling up here.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah. So he says, in one of the cases I'm working on now, one of the low-level demons, he had never possessed anybody. And the reason God told him you have to possess this woman is because in her battle to get this thing out, she was going to reach an extreme level of holiness. So God uses the demons as instruments. The demons will admit as much. So they don't get to choose anything. God lets demons do what they do for our sanctification ultimately.
That's a very interesting idea. So in my daily life, I do speeches for business groups, and what I say to them is that without pain, you don't have a story. Without Hans Gruber taking hostages on Christmas Eve, Detective John McClane can't be a hero. And it seems to me that what we're talking about goes back to the earlier part of our conversation, this almost as yin and yang. You need them together. Although we may abhor evil and especially the more gruesome things that you were talking about earlier, it's necessary from a perspective that maybe we are not privy to, that God understands better than we do at times.
Right. But that doesn't counsel for us to then just do nothing. Like this
Yes,
Catholic priest is still performing exorcisms,
correct.
even though there might have been a purpose to the evil.
Yes. One thing that I want to go back to, these other entities that we are talking about. There's this idea called the psychosphere, and you and I talked about this offline when I first met you. And I learned about it from watching the TV show True Detective. Speaking of other predictive programming, and so in the show, especially for the first season, it is very dark, and they have these ritualized killings that they're investigating. And I read this very interesting article that because unfortunately the show ends on more of a cliffhanger. The good guys don't even get the bad guys, and by the way, the good guys were very much gray hats. We'll put it that way.
Okay.
Anyway, the point that he was making in this article is that there is a higher reality that is going on, something called the psychosphere. And you talked about this in the book that I read of yours, where there may be entities that exist and for in the same way that we consume material food for nourishment, they consume human suffering. And I wondered if you could talk to me a little bit about that idea.
Yeah, and it's actually something that I've heard from people who claim they've survived from dark rituals where they were being ritually abused, and the abusers were doing it with the intention of invoking demonic beings, basically.
Hmm.
Like so sophisticated torture, really dark stuff. But survivors of this will talk about basically how the suffering induced on the humans is something that the demons feed off of, especially as it pertains to children. That seems to be a theme of because children have a great sense of innocence or an energy, perhaps. So maybe there's more energy to feed off of. But it's almost like these dark beings can only survive by being parasitic. Whereas the force of love, I'm thinking of one survivor in particular, he says it's ultimately the stronger one that can never be transcended. But these parasitic forces are going to they have to be parasitic because they can only survive by by perverting basically the innocence.
Yeah, I mean that is a very difficult thing to wrap your head around as well. And so it's interesting going back to the movies and the TV shows that we watch. One of them is, of course, a trope that comes up a lot is zombies, right? And I think we've experienced a lot of people that are, let's just say, like NPCs, right?
Mhm.
So they're just not active in their lives, and that's going on societally. But the other one is vampires. There's so many different depictions of vampires in society. And it sounds like that's what we're talking about, this emotional vampirism, where just taking the life force and the joy, like almost like the Dementors in Harry Potter. That's what
Mhm.
it reminds me of.
Yeah. And I do wonder if it happens on a physical level too, like that there might be some little reality to vampires. I don't know, but I'm open to it now that they can be parasitic in whatever way they need to be. And yeah.
When we talk about these things, let me put it this way: there are people in my life who seem to have all the answers, and they believe in a very concrete material reality. There's nothing else to explore. We've got all the answers, right? But as I hear you talk, it seems to me that life is just so much more complex and interesting. There's just so much that we don't understand and know.
Yeah, that's where I'm landing. The more I learn and have researched for books I write, the more I feel like I don't know. So basically, the space of the unknown grows for me the more I learn. It's this paradoxical thing. The more
Yeah.
I learn, the more I realize I don't know, which then leads me to think, okay, how much do I not even know today? Where when I do know it, I will realize the space of the unknown is even greater. So I try to hold this sense of number one, just not knowing, but then also the inability to even comprehend, even if I wanted to know, like the 2D flatland
Right,
versus the
exactly.
multidimensional
Yes.
sphere.
Right. The more that you learn, if I can paraphrase it, the more you appreciate how much unknown unknowns there may be that you can't even
Yes.
contemplate. I want to go back to this thing. I think the hardest part of the discussion with evil is when it has to do with children. And this is just my take on what you said, and I'd love for yours. Um, if we can imagine that there is a spectrum with good over here and evil over here, right? The most purest good thing there is and the most evil thing over here. Children are they're here. They're absolutely here. They're innocent. They naive. They don't understand even what's going on. Like if we were to talk about a horrible atrocity committed on a child, the child doesn't even understand what's going on, much less are they able to resist it. And it's such a perversion and such a ghastly, horrible thing to hurt a child like this. And but if I'm thinking about it from the evil standpoint, it's almost it makes it that much more of a win, right? To enact something horrible on a child is the worst thing that this entity could do. Um, I don't know if that makes sense, but what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's where I land as well. And I think your comments about trying to shield children from things in society, like that resonates with me so much more now than it used to, because I see a lot of what's happening culturally. So
Mhm.
many examples of this as probably ways of getting into the psyche of the children. So it doesn't have to be in the most gruesome physical ritual where people are being abused and children are being abused, where the abuse is occurring. It can be on this more subtle level of the psyche or exposure to things that can be harmful to the innocence of a child. And so perhaps evil works in all these various ways.
One other component of evil that you've touched upon is deception, and we began talking earlier about our misconceptions of history. And when I think about other evils that you can inflict upon people, it seems to me one of the other ones that is so devastating is the big lie and deception. And from reading, I'm reading the second book you've written right now. You've written 5 books, am I right? Or is it six?
7.
7. Wow. Okay. We were talking, one of the books has to do, they all have to do with, understanding our place in the universe and the ways in which we may be misled. And it seems to me that if it is true that our history is wrong, where we live is wrong, our abilities are wrong, that we're living under a big lie, and that is one of the most evil things that there are, in the sense you don't know where you came from, you don't know who you are, and you don't even know your own purpose here. How does that fit into your ontology and your thoughts about evil?
Yeah, it's a big part of it that I'm still trying to work through. And I want to give the history of this. So I started off before I was researching anything as I would call myself, I would have been an atheist or an agnostic.
Hmm.
I thought everything was basically just material. We live in a random and meaningless universe. When we die, that's the end of our consciousness. There's certainly no afterlife or reincarnation. That would be crazy talk.
Hmm.
Or the paranormal. That's all just that's not true. And when I wrote my first 2 books, trying to show that the materialist paradigm is incorrect, I think there's a lot of scientific and philosophical evidence to suggest that all those things I believed before are not true. And I came across many spiritual philosophies that I really liked. My first 2 books, An End to Upside Down Thinking, then An End to Upside Down Living. And then everything with COVID went down. And I saw a lot of the people that I really respected in the realms that I explored in my first 2 books that I thought were really spiritually on point were falling for the narrative, let's just say. There were things that could be shown demonstrably as deceptions if you just actually researched outside the mainstream narrative, where we were being lied to objectively. And yet the people that I thought were so spiritually evolved were latching on to that mainstream narrative, which I thought was a deception, and then proliferating it basically and saying that if you didn't believe it, then you were a problem or heaven forbid, a conspiracy theorist, like that term would come up. And not everyone in that world was falling for it. I saw a divide, basically. So it made me ask a lot of questions. I'm like, is there something missing in the spiritual philosophy that I was talking about? Like, what's going on? So I think that's been probably the impetus in many ways behind the last 5 books, books 3 through 7, of like, how do we reconcile the fact that there could even be deception among those who seem to get it right with the science of spirituality. So it's like there are levels to the deception. It's not just a single deception. There are layers of ignorance that have been imposed upon us where they might not always be obvious, and sometimes otherwise good people who really do care can fall for some of this stuff. And what does that mean for us as individuals if we have these layers of ignorance that you're kind of describing in so many different ways? Are we then at a subconscious level always feeling like there's something off? Does that affect our health? Are we then less strong to be able to combat the dark forces? And then your last part of the question is basically how does it all fit in? And perhaps it's just all part of the evolutionary process that part of the evolution is for us to be able to transcend and see through and have the discernment to understand that these deceptions exist and to free ourselves from them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I tell this to my children. When I was a kid growing up, I looked up at adults and I thought they had all the answers. And then you become a grown up and you realize that most adults have no idea what they're doing. And then they also are making it up as they go. And I think that, as you mentioned earlier, there's a humility, much like Socrates, where to say that I just don't know that answer. I
Yeah.
don't know those things. But I think from that humility, if you if you're proceeding correctly, you will say to yourself, I want to learn more. I realize I don't know and I want to learn more. And I also think a sense of empathy comes through as well. When it comes to the horrors of COVID or even, God forbid, the Holocaust, there were so many people that were so assured that they were right and that they were willing to do terrible things in the name of being right. And I came across this in the book, The Banality of Evil, when they were talking about the Stanford prison experiments. And it didn't take long for the students, the college students that were put in the roles of the guards to become tyrants and to be so certain that what they were doing was correct and that they were okay to mete out any kind of punishment that they deemed appropriate. And then afterwards, I think Zimbardi cut the experiment to only 3 or 4 days. He just shut the whole thing down, right? And I think, but just to put a cap on this, what I'm saying is I think that we could all learn from our mistakes and recognize that there's just so much more that we can learn, and that we risk a danger of thinking that we are absolutely correct, and that we have these other people that are absolutely wrong, and that we are entitled to do whatever we want to those people.
Right. And like I think you're alluding to, the fact that it's within all of us that we could enact these things that we are criticizing other people for.
Right.
And I want to go back to David Hawkins. He told this story that I can't get out of my mind, where as he was elevating in his consciousness to these various states, some would call them states of enlightenment, he claims he encountered what seems like an entity that basically said to him, "You've transcended all of your personal karma. All power is yours over others. You take it." And he said this happened in an instant, and he thought to himself in a split second, I, I am everything, so why would I need power over others? I reject this. He calls it a luciferic temptation, and he claims that at some point every soul will encounter it. He also claims that he was shown at that time which other advanced beings took the temptation at that point in their journey and which ones rejected it. And he claims the ones that took the temptation basically had to start at the beginning of their soul's journey. Because they were so advanced and then still felt for it,
Yeah.
they had a bigger fall. And often, like I wrote about this in my second book, and End Upside Down Living, I talked about the dangers in the spiritual path. And little did I know how many other areas of evil I would later explore. But the three areas apparently that get people on the spiritual journey: money, sex, and power. Some
Mhm.
version of those. And depending on where we are weakest, we might get overtaken or we might succumb to it. And I think that's a very interesting framework to think about for all of us: money, sex, and power, because maybe the deception will come at us in the way that is hardest for us to resist
Yeah.
based on where we are in our evolution. And like you're at the most advanced level of the video game, so that the enemy that comes to you is going to be really, really tricky.
Yeah.
And so it's something what David Hawkins actually said very often in his lectures before he passed away was that he felt an obligation to tell everyone about this luciferic temptation because he says, you're all going to face it. And at least I let you know
Yeah.
that it's going to come.
I had a friend that told me, he's a very enlightened individual. He had a dream like that. Exactly what you're talking about, where he was given a temptation, and it was even darker than what you mentioned. And he did say no to the temptation, and it was a very powerful nightmare he told me about. I want to go back to talking about just the idea of evil writ large. So when we look around the world right now, there are some very powerful, very rich people, speaking of money, sex, and power, who seem to be operating with full power to do whatever they want. I think about the folks like George Soros, um, the Rothschilds in ages past, many different very rich, very powerful people, whether they be celebrities, influencers, politicians. When you look around at the people that we're held up to follow, um, do you sense that there could be something more going on that the people that are held up and to be revered and to look up to are almost in talking about what you mentioned a moment ago, it's almost like the devil's trick. Fall behind these people, they're the ones you should follow, but really they've been seduced by evil in different ways. Not to say that those people haven't, but just you get the idea.
Yeah, so you're raising a general principle that evil seems to abide by, which is inversion, inverting truth. And it's interesting, my books are all about upside down. At the time when I first started writing, I didn't know that inversion was going to be such an important part of my journey, but that's what seems to be the case. And what I've gotten to the point now where if someone is revered by the mainstream press, just let's just say it, the mainstream narrative,
Yeah.
then I automatically wonder if there's something that we're missing with that person. Whereas someone, if someone is being demonized, my
Hmm.
first question is this person is probably speaking some truth. Let me actually go to the primary source and see what this person's actually about versus what the media says or what the mainstream narrative says. And almost every time, maybe every time, I realize there's truth to what that person's saying, and the person is arguably being demonized for bringing out a truth.
Yeah. By the way, I feel the same way whenever I go on a YouTube video and they have a Wikipedia entry at the bottom to explain whatever it is, I realize that whatever they're talking about is probably on the money. And YouTube is trying to get them to think differently. Going back to, if I could just kind of bring this full circle, this interview, we've been talking about some very dark things. We've been talking about probably the darkest things that you can discuss. Um, do you ever feel overwhelming despair?
Hmm. There were times when I studied evil where I did, and I had to stop. And when I say studied evil, I'm talking about the details of how people are tortured in rituals that are intended to bring about demonic forces.
Yeah.
That was wearing on me to the point where I said that if there's little value now, like the marginal value is not worth it
Mhm.
because I get the picture. So I do think there's a fine line to tread with all the stuff of understanding the reality of evil without getting sucked into it, because that could be a danger too. Where maybe it brings you down so into such a state of despair that you have lost to it, where you then are not a force of good in the world. So it's the fine line of understanding that it exists and knowing enough to be able to navigate around it while not being consumed. So I've actually, since that point of maybe peak darkness, at least of learning about what's going on in the world, I definitely have become desensitized to it after having learned about it. But I do feel more hopeful because I think so many truths are coming out at an accelerating rate. And I see it in my own life, my own development, but also just around me. And even in the media, we're seeing a lot of things that used to be considered crazy conspiracy that are being entertained very seriously. That's evolution, that we should be able to question everything. So I do feel hopeful in that regard on a mass scale, but I do think it's the choice of the individual. And coming from such a mainstream background, I know there are a lot of people from my, let's say, prior life, who don't seem to be acknowledging alternative narratives or even questioning. And it makes me think that maybe some people will never want to in this lifetime. And that's, I guess, part of their life. So part of me despairs in that because I feel like it will lead to some perhaps more suffering and less freedom for them. But then again, it's not my job to tell someone else what they should do with their life. And then there's this bifurcation where many other people are asking more and more questions. And that seems like a very positive thing.
Speaking of other fictional depictions and archetypes, Darth Vader at the end of Return of the Jedi is redeemed. He saves his son, and Luke sees the good in him. You mentioned earlier that you heard these horrific accounts, and I've read your book and some of the stuff. I mean, you even prepare the reader for the disturbing nature of what they're going to read, and even then, it's pretty disturbing. And I know that, and I've read other things, so I know that you were parsing it and trying to go easy on the reader.
Yeah,
When it comes to someone that does these horrific things, is it possible to be redeemed?
it's a great question. Well, it's a metaphysical question. So it's an ontological question. What's the nature of reality? And if reality is ultimately benevolent at the core, at the highest level, then I would guess there has to be some redemption at some level. Maybe it takes a really long time. Maybe it's unimaginable how the redemption could occur. But often when people are perpetrating these intense evils, that is someone who's been horribly traumatized. That's how the cycle seems to go. So if you traumatize someone badly, then you can use them as a pawn to then traumatize others. So in some sense, we can see the innocence in the perpetrator, which is a really hard thing to do. We can see that that person is suffering at such a deep level. You're reminding me of a story that I told in my second book, Into Upside Down Living, when I talk about there's a chapter on 10 approaches for living life with this ontology of like oneness and interconnectedness. And one of them is forgiveness. I told a story of a woman named Asira who said that she was being murdered by a man and had basically some kind of otherworldly experience where the dimensions opened up and she was able to feel his suffering that led him to do this. And also, he was able to see that he was doing something really bad. So he stopped and he said, "Oh my goodness, I'm killing an angel." So he ended up taking her to the hospital, I think, and saved her life. So she ended up forgiving him in a sense. She didn't like him in the end, but she felt the pain and suffering that was causing this man to try to murder her. And that led her to understand where he was coming from, at least. To me, that's a very powerful analogy that we could apply so many other places.
So going with that idea, I think the other part of evil that you touched upon is the idea of forgiveness. Are there some things that are unforgivable when it comes to evil?
Depends on how we define the term forgiveness. So the way I think about it from Isira's perspective, where she was being murdered and she quote unquote forgave this man, it means she understood where he was coming from, but it didn't mean that she wanted to engage with him ever again, and she was still very angry with him.
Hmm.
So I think if we take the maybe the most lenient definition of forgiveness, which is just to have an understanding and not to hold anger, not to hold something that's going to weigh us down toward that person, because that's the danger, is if you don't forgive someone, then it's like you're digging two graves. If you want revenge, then you dig a grave for yourself, because then you're going to hold that anger in a very negative way versus having maybe a healthy distaste for someone, but having the understanding to forgive. So there's some kind of balance there. I haven't figured out myself where forgiveness is really important and useful.
You talked earlier about this idea of trauma breeds more trauma, and that's definitely the situation in Good Will Hunting, where you see these kind of things going again and again. What is your best advice for breaking this cycle for generational trauma?
Mm. It's a deep question. There's so many different modalities. I've been more recently looking at something called family constellations, which I looked at years ago and I've been returning to it. The idea that generational trauma is actually held somehow energetically within us. So we might be traumatized as individuals for something that had nothing to do with us in this lifetime. It's an ancestor that was dealing with it. And basically, the approach is that there's some part of us that, because we love our ancestors, we suffer for them. It's a very profound idea. It's like we are showing our love for our ancestors by suffering.
Interesting.
So that's one way we could look at this. There are approaches also just being aware of things that have happened in your own life if we ignore the ancestral stuff, which can be painful to say, what did I actually experience? Meditation can help unlock this. Psychotherapy can help. There are many different ways you can do it. But it's like the first step is to say, I want to acknowledge the trauma in my own life. And perhaps if we all did that on a collective level, if we went within and handled the darkness within us,
Mhm.
that would probably be the solution to really help the world. But it takes that step to say, I want to do that. And for many people, it's understandable why you wouldn't want to, because it often involves reliving some pain and then actually working through it rather than keeping it suppressed, which many people have to do in order to live.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up, I want to mention, I saw you on Kim Iverson's show. I thought you were fascinating, and I had to read your books, and I had to meet you. And luckily we had a friend in common, so thank you for this. But and you were talking about evil on Kim's show, and I just wanted to pick your brain more. But you mentioned you've written 7 books and counting, and I know you come from the banking world and very very distant from what you do now. What are your plans in the future, and how can people follow your work and get to know you even more?
Well, first, Michael, thank you for the opportunity. And I really appreciate that you're willing to go in all these avenues. So I think it's awesome journalism you're doing. My website is a good place to start if your audience is interested in learning more. It's markgober.com, markgober.com. Like you said, I've written 7 books. They're all available in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible formats. I read the Audible myself. And I also have a podcast series produced in 2019. It's only 8 episodes. It's a narrative format, so it's like bingeable, but
Mhm.
it's on the nature of consciousness and whether consciousness comes from the brain. Is there scientific evidence for the afterlife, for psychic phenomena? Many people who get into my work start with that podcast because it's probably the most digestible. And that's still available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the major players.
By the way, I've seen it. I mean, I've heard it. It's excellent. I love it. So I
Thanks.
recommend that to everybody. You know, Kim said it to you as well. She said you should do another podcast series. So I'm going to double down on that. I think what you have to say is just so insightful and intriguing. So I just want to say thanks again, and I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Michael.